I'm very happy to welcome you all to this evening's presentation. It's the first of our 2008-9 series of research and progress seminars for the Center for Research on Vermont. And our speaker this evening is no newcomer to UVM nor to this center. Garrison Nelson, professor of political science at UVM, has been here since 1968. He teaches courses in American government, political leadership, political parties, is the editor, co-editor, editor-in-chief of a number of very significant works, reference works and research works, and is also the author of over 100 articles on such topics as the U.S. Congress and the political system in this country. And it's now my pleasure to introduce him to you and let him take over.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Yes. A noble band of listeners to this talk. In any case, this is basically going to be personality-driven, largely because politics in Vermont is personality-driven. And as Frank will dispute me on this, but Vermont, as you know, is really not a state. It is a theme park. And I'll be talking about some of the people who have expressed the themes of the uniqueness of Vermont. And I'm going to start with Matthew Lyon. Now, and try to bring this up to contemporary terms. What makes this election fascinating, as we know, is that we have small states in the mix. Sarah Palin from Alaska, got 3 electoral votes. Barack Obama was born in Hawaii with only 4 electoral votes. Joe Biden from Delaware with only 3 electoral votes. And of course, our beloved Vice President Richard Cheney from Wyoming with 3 electoral votes. So small states are making a comeback in politics. And so Vermont being the 49th largest state, I figured, we might do a quick romp through its history to see what we can learn about presidential politics. Now, I'm beginning with Matthew Lyon. Matthew Lyon was born in Dublin. This is a rendition from Vermont Life from a couple of years ago. We don't know that he looked like that. But we do have a cartoon of Matthew Lyon. And this is a very famous cartoon. This is the first fist fight in the history of the House of Representatives. Roger Griswold this is Roger Griswold from Connecticut at Yale, who went over to Lyon, accused him of being a coward. Lyon spit in his face and grabbed the fireplace tongs and went after him, and this went on. Roger actually won this battle, so Matthew ended up losing the first fist fight in the history of the House of Representatives. And this took place in 1798. He then, while he was editing the Fairhaven Gazette, was publishing an interesting set of documents and a little kind of monthly magazine, which was called The Scourge of Aristocracy and Repository of Important Political Truths. And this was seen as sedition against President John Adams of Massachusetts. And Matthew was one of 25 editors who were brought up under the Sedition Act. 10 of them were convicted, and Matthew actually went to jail for 4 months, but was elected out of jail, a great noble tradition in Vermont. Bernie Sanders, by the way, wants to make a postage stamp honoring Matthew Lyon. Obviously, seeing certainly emotional kinsman. Now, what we also have with Lyon, after Lyon basically decides the election of 1800, and this is why he plays this important role in presidential politics. So the election of 1800, there we go, 1800. The election of 1800 was the second election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. In the first election between Jefferson and John Adams, Jefferson lost to Adams 71-68. However, Adams got the most votes, which made him elected president under the Constitution. Jefferson got the second most, and under the original Constitution, the second most candidate would be the vice president. So here you have president of one party, vice president of another. Needless to say, Jefferson was not invited to any cabinet meetings, and Jefferson spent his time presiding over the House, and being the genius that he was, he wrote the rules of procedure for the House of Representatives, which are still in use today, Jefferson's manual. Well, they have a rematch in 1800, and the key difference, as you can probably see, is New York State. New York State going from Adams to Jefferson. And of course, New York State was led by Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr, who was the son of the president of Princeton and the grandson of the great theologian Jonathan Edwards. Well, Burr and Jefferson got 73 electoral votes each. So basically, the assumption was that Jefferson would be the presidential candidate, Burr would be the vice president, but they had the same number of electoral votes. And under the Constitution, they had to go to the House of Representatives. Now, at this point, there were 16 states in the House of Representatives. You had the original 13, plus Vermont, plus Kentucky, plus Tennessee. Now, the House was the old House, and it was controlled by the Federalist Party. Theodore Sedgwick of Western Massachusetts was the Speaker. And they basically were pro-Adams. So basically what was happening was that the Jefferson states, there were 8 of them, went for Jefferson, so he had 8 votes. The Adams states went for Aaron Burr, so it was 6 states. So it was 8, 6, and 2 states split. Maryland split 4-4, and Vermont split 1-1. Now, the hope on the part of the Federalists was that they could get Burr, whom they thought was fundamentally corrupt, as president, and Jefferson, whom they thought was crazy. But the key player in all of this was Alexander Hamilton, who despised Aaron Burr. But nevertheless, for 35 ballots, the vote was 8 for Jefferson, 6 for Burr, and the 2 states split. Finally, on the 36th ballot, Lewis Morris, who was the other Vermont representative, Matthew Lyon being the other one, Lewis Morris doesn't show up. And so Matthew Lyon casts Vermont's vote, the 1 vote now, and Jefferson becomes president. So this is, Lyon's revenge, on the Federalists by getting Jefferson elected. Of course, we don't, now why Lewis Morris stepped out, we don't know, but he was the nephew of Gouverneur Morris, who was a close friend of Washington's, a very close friend of Hamilton's, and we do not know whether or not he had already been told the tale about Burr having carnal knowledge of his daughter, which of course contributed to the great duel in New Jersey between Hamilton and Burr, leading to Hamilton's death. Of course, they had the duel not in New York, where both were from, but in New Jersey, which was sort of soprano country in Weehawken, New Jersey. Now, the next player in all of this is the presidential politics. Well, actually, let me just kind of skip ahead to an interesting election, which was the election of 1812. The election of 1812 was an election where Vermont broke from New England. Vermont did not vote as New England had voted. And you can see that. The election of 1812 was between James Madison and DeWitt Clinton, who was the mayor of New York City. So yes, Rudy Giuliani was not the first mayor of New York City to entertain presidential aspirations. And you can see Vermont quite distinctly different from the rest of the Northeast. And basically, Madison, in terms of the original states of the Union, Madison wins the electoral votes, 90 electoral votes, and Clinton wins 89. But it's the new states that go for Madison, and Vermont being a new state, the first new state, going along that same line. Now we have 1816, which is an interesting election, because this is the last election where the Federalists play a role. The Federalists between 1812 and 1816 commit an incredible, foolhardy stunt. They get convinced by New Englanders, led by Roger Griswold, who fought with Matthew Lyon, to secede from the Union. This is the so-called Hartford Convention. And however, the War of 1812 goes well, turns out to be a draw, as we know. But the Brits leave the United States and go off to the west and the north. And the war is technically a success. And the Federalist Party, which had committed itself to kind of considering secession, ends up casting its last breath in the 1816 election, and they're gone. So Vermont was much more ahead of the curve than the rest of New England. Now, the next key player in all of Vermont's political history is Millard Fillmore. Good Lord, Millard Fillmore. Who the hell is Millard Fillmore? Millard Fillmore Millard Fillmore's parents his father was from Vermont, and here's a picture of old Millard's dad and himself. Here we go. Millard Fillmore, you say, born in the southern part of the state, moved west, moving into Buffalo, New York, where Millard was raised, and Millard was elected to the House of Representatives, served on the Ways and Means Committee, and was elected vice president along with Zachary Taylor in 1848. And of course, Zachary Taylor, as we know, died in 1850, and Millard became president. Millard, as I say, a relatively undistinguished character. When I came to Vermont, the place called the other place down here, the tavern down here was actually called the Millard Fillmore for reasons I have no idea. But that's what the only distinction that Millard seemed to have here in his state that had birthed his father. Now, Fillmore was not nominated for president in 1852 by the Whig Party. They nominated General Winfield Scott, a.k.a. Old Fuss and Feathers, who lost. But Fillmore stuck around. And Fillmore was nominated for president in 1856 by a party called the American Party, sometimes known as the Know-Nothings, whose major platform was was anti-immigrant platform against the Irish and Germans who had come over in the 1840s and early 1850s. Of course, the Germans came to this country because they wanted to farm, and they, of course, moved west into Illinois and Wisconsin. The Irish did not want to come to farm because they sucked at farming, the potato famine being the obvious evidence of that. And so they wanted to settle in the cities. And so the American Party, which was funded in large part by Samuel F.B. Morse, graduate of Yale, and a multimillionaire of the time, and basically funded this Know-Nothing party that Fillmore represented in the 1856 election against Buchanan and Fremont. So there's the Fillmore link. Now, moving on, we have the next picture. It involves a native of Vermont by the name of Stephen Douglas, Stephen A. Douglas from Brandon, Vermont. Stephen A. Douglas was 13 years old when he left the state, apparently stunted his growth. He was only 5'3", and is known as the Little Giant. The Little Giant. In Congress, he was chairman of the Territories Committee, and he was the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which caused an enormous amount of havoc because it was an effort, obviously, to extend slavery beyond the Missouri River into Kansas. They pretty much conceded that Nebraska would be a free state, but Kansas is where the battle took place, and Stephen Douglas was responsible for that. And Stephen, of course, his major claim to fame was debating Abraham Lincoln in 1858, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which Douglas basically won because he was reelected. And in 1860, Douglas was the nominee of the Northern Democrats. Now, in those days, the Democrats had a two-thirds rule, and if you did not get two-thirds of the delegate vote, you had to, you had to wait and wait and wait. And at one point, they went on for over 100 ballots. But in this case, the Democrats decided to hold two conventions. And the Northern Democratic Convention nominated Douglas, and the Southern one nominated John Breckinridge as vice president under Buchanan. In any case, Douglas runs in 1860 as the candidate of the Northern Democrats, and he wins one state. He wins Missouri. That's it. That's it in that particular election. So, and he loses to whom? He loses to Abraham Lincoln, the man that he had just defeated in the 1858 Senate contest. Now, the legend goes is that Douglas and Lincoln had both contended for the hands of Mary Todd and Kentucky heiress, and of course, presumably Lincoln won, but actually Douglas won because Mary was a loon and, flipped out rather seriously and often. There's another bizarre little footnote, which is Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, owns a home down in Manchester, a beautiful place called Hildene. Robert Todd Lincoln, by the way, was present at the assassinations of his father, Garfield, and William McKinley. So he's not a person you want to invite to any major gathering. Okay, so poor Stephen. Stephen, runs and loses, actually dies the following year. Now, some of the another character that we have in this is one of my faves. And this is a guy who actually went to UVM. Didn't last long. This is Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens, born in Danville, came to UVM. It was actually a summer course. Back in the day, the local Burlington farmers used to graze their cattle out in front of the old mill, and cows being cows, left we would facetiously call meadow muffins. And students were sitting in them and stepping in them and getting somewhat irritated at this local farmer who was doing that. And so the legend is that Thaddeus and his buddies took one of the farmer's cows, brought it over probably by Pomeroy, and beheaded it in Godfather style to teach the farmer a lesson, for which Thaddeus got kicked out of school. But he went across the river, went across the Connecticut River over to Hanover and down to Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, where cow worship is less prevalent. Vermonters were kind of the Hindus of New England. And then he went off to Pennsylvania and had made his fortune. He was elected to the Congress from Pennsylvania as a Whig, and then when the new Republican Party was created, he became leader of the Republican Party. In the Republican House at the time, during the Civil War, he was the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, which is a person who's written extensively in the Ways and Means Committee, is the most important committee in the House of Representatives. And in 1863, they decided to split the appropriations function, the spending function, away from the taxing function, which Ways and Means possessed. And Thaddeus ends up as the first chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. And when he left the House Appropriations Committee, he left it in the worthy hands of Justin Morrill. Justin Morrill, another Vermonter from the Northeast Kingdom. So Vermont, at this point, had the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee and the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, clearly all-time peak in power in the U.S. House of Representatives. But there's old Justin Morrill there. Now, the next sort of piece of business involves Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes' father was also born. Actually, I'm going to talk about Luke Poland for a moment. This is a handsome devil. This is Luke Poland, U.S. Senator from Vermont. And Luke was the chairman of the committee that investigated the Credit Mobilier scandal. And the Credit Mobilier scandal implicated James G. Blaine and James Garfield. So Luke, honest and reputable soul. I mean, this is talk about the quintessential, picture of the stern U.S. senator. I showed this to one of our secretaries, and she said he looks like a leader of a religious cult. Could be. In any case, that leads us up to the next election where Vermonters play a role, and this is the 1876 contest. 1876 contest, we have Rutherford B. Hayes, his father was born in Vermont, and William Wheeler, a man whose name you absolutely have never heard of. Hayes was his father was born in Brattleboro, and his wife was born in Wilmington, and ran a general store with John Noyes. We have the famous John Humphrey Noyes of the Oneida community involved there. But Hayes is the first graduate of Harvard Law School to be nominated and the first to win. Actually, the first to win an election. Now we have a graduate. Well, I think we have a graduate of Harvard Law on the ticket this year with Mr. Barack Obama. Now he ran with William Wheeler, who was a congressman from upstate New York, from Malone, who went to UVM, but never finished at UVM, apparently developing an eye infection because the meal plan was pretty horrible at the time, consisting mostly of bread and water, is what he said. So in any case, Wheeler dropped out of UVM. When Hayes was told that William Wheeler was to be his running mate, he said, to his wife, "Who's Wheeler?" Not a very, encouraging piece of business. Because you have to understand, in the good old days, the presidential nominees did not pick the vice presidential candidates. They were chosen by the nominating convention. And here's another picture roll of Rutherford. Now, how does Rutherford make it? How does he get elected? Well, he gets elected, as you perhaps know from American history. Rutherford B. Hayes lost the election by 250,000 votes to Samuel Tilden. Here's another. Here's some more Wheeler pictures. Stern character. He lost that election, but there were 20 electoral votes in dispute, and so they couldn't go to the House of Representatives because the votes were actually in dispute, and they were mostly from the South. Florida was one of them. Needless to say, Florida was because of the Reconstruction troops who were located in the southern states, and they created an electoral commission. And there were 5 members of the House, which was controlled by the Democrats, so 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, 5 members of the Senate, 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats, and 5 members of the Supreme Court. And there were 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 1 independent, David Davis from Illinois. And the anticipation was that Davis would pick the president, because there were 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans on the commission. Davis did not want to pick the president. So Davis left the Supreme Court, was elected to the Senate, and an 8th Republican was named to the commission, and all 20 electoral votes were decided 8-7 in favor of Rutherford B. Hayes. So even though he lost the election by 250,000 votes, he was sworn in as president. So the next Vermonter we have is, on the committee was George Edmunds. George F. Edmunds from Richmond. He's a lawyer here in Burlington, and for whom the Edmunds School is named, a couple of blocks away. And Edmunds was on the commission. He's one of the Republican members of the commission who voted to put Hayes into office. Edmunds got ambitious himself and was a contender for the 1884 nomination. Now, next Vermonter to show up, Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur. This is Arthur's father. Arthur's father, was an Irish immigrant. Married a woman from New Hampshire, went to Pierpoint, up by Littleton, right? One of those little tiny towns. Piermont. Thank you, Frank. In your part of the state. He was once again a lawyer in Burlington, but he got religion. And the worst religion to get is to become a Baptist, because if you're a Baptist, you're an evangelist. Man, you got the good news. And he had the good news, and the problem is that Baptists, don't have regular parish. They go from place to place to place, and in the course of going from place to place to place, Chester was born here in Vermont. Have any of you ever been to the Chester Arthur birthplace? Have you been there, Frank? Frank, you got to go there. It's at the end of this poor, sad dirt road up in Fairfield. Little tiny yellow shack. This ain't the Kennedy Library, I can tell you that. And Arthur was president longer than Kennedy was. You've been there? It's basically yellow. They think that may be what the building looked like. It's pretty unimpressive. And here's a president of the United States who served, for almost 4 years. Now, he became president because Garfield was shot by a crazy, quote, disappointed office seeker by the name of Charles Guiteau. Charles Guiteau had this belief that if he shot Garfield and Arthur became president, that Arthur would be so grateful for making him president that he'd name him ambassador to France. Didn't happen. In any case, so Guiteau shoots Garfield. Now, Garfield's a fairly, healthy, strong fellow, and he doesn't die right away. So they put him, bring him to New Jersey, and all the great doctors of the land come to visit Garfield to find the bullet. They can't find the bullet anywhere. And so with their unwashed hands, they're shoving their fingers into the wound, trying to find the bullet. Can't find it. So they call upon the great genius of the era, Alexander Graham Bell, to come down from Boston and to find the bullet. Well, he has this metal detecting equipment. And what happens is, he checks out with Garfield, and every time Garfield lies down, the metal detector goes off, and every time Garfield leans forward, it stops. Well, of course, what's he hearing? He's listening to the metal springs in the bed is what he's hearing. So much for his genius. And eventually, of course, Garfield expires, and Arthur becomes president. So Arthur is not nominated in 1884. We have a fascinating three-way race between New Englanders. Arthur, who was born in Vermont, George F. Edmunds was born in Vermont, and James G. Blaine was born in Pennsylvania and was representing Maine in the Congress, and Blaine becomes the nominee and, of course, loses to Grover Cleveland. Okay, now, let's see, here's some more. This is the Chester Arthur. This is the campaign brochure, and this is Chester. Chester is a big fellow. It basically was apparently an honest president, but was sort of a dishonest politician, going up the ladder from New York State, but then being corrupted by New York State, no surprise to any of us. Now, the next guy is Levi P. Morton. Levi P. Morton. Levi P. Morton was from Shoreham, and he ran with Benjamin Harrison. And Harrison ran against Cleveland in 1888, and once again got fewer popular votes than did Cleveland, but the Electoral College at that point was really decided by two states, New York and Indiana. And New York and Indiana, which had voted for Cleveland in 84, voted for Harrison in 88 and turned the election around. And his vice presidency was Levi P. Morton, who was chosen from New York and later becomes governor of New York, as you can see. He develops quite an elaborate mustache in his later years. Now, then the Tafts. Here we have the Tafts. This is probably the most distinguished political family with Vermont ties. This is Alphonso Taft. Alphonso Taft was from East Townsend, Vermont. Went off to Yale. While at Yale, he and his buddy decided to found a social club known as Skull and Bones. Alphonso Taft is the co-founder of Skull and Bones. And so when his son, William Howard Taft, goes to Yale, he becomes a member of Skull and Bones, of course, as George H.W. Bush and his father. Prescott Bush, remember Skull and Bones, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and of course John Forbes Kerry, all members of Skull and Bones. So this is the Taft line. Taft's father served in 2 cabinet positions in the Grant administration and wasn't indicted. So that's a relative success in the Grant administration. And of course, William Howard Taft became Governor General of the Philippines. His son, Robert A. Taft, who ran against Eisenhower, actually ran 3 times for the nomination in 1940, 48, and 52, was born in the Philippines while his father was Governor General. Taft was later elevated to Secretary of War under Teddy Roosevelt. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt found out McKinley had been shot while he was hanging out in Isle of Lamont. And the news came that McKinley had been shot. They did not know whether he was dead, but that was the first news that Teddy got. And of course, then he left to go back to New York. And of course, McKinley then died. Once again, then Robert Todd Lincoln was in the crowd. A unique convergence of circumstances there. So Taft runs, and Taft gets the nomination in 1908. And in 1908, Taft gets the great opportunity to run against the all-time loser in American politics, William Jennings Bryan, who's now running for his 3rd contest, and McKinley had defeated him twice. Taft gets a chance to knock him off in 1908, so Taft gets elected. The problem that Taft has is Taft has really got a judicial temperament, is not a strong partisan. Democrats take control of the Congress in 1910. Teddy Roosevelt is infuriated, and he decides to take back the presidency. And he wins. Teddy comes back in this new invention called presidential preference primaries. And Teddy enters the presidential preference primaries in 1912 and wins them, wins most of the presidential preference primaries. But the convention is not going to give Teddy the nomination. They instead give it to William Howard Taft. Teddy, being Teddy, decides to challenge Taft, and of course creates his own party, the Progressive Party, with the bull moose. And I noticed the Vermont progressives have adopted the bull moose as their symbol. I'm not sure they quite understand. They have very little resemblance to the Teddy Roosevelt agenda, but nevertheless, it's obviously a powerful symbol. And so Teddy runs, and this is the ultimate Ivy League election because Teddy, of course, is a graduate of Harvard, Taft, a graduate of Yale, and Woodrow Wilson was a graduate of Princeton. So the three major Ivies were all represented in that race. Well, the election takes place, and here's what happens. Teddy wins 6 states. Wilson wins 40 states, 435 electoral votes, because Teddy and Taft split the vote. And Taft carries 2 states, Utah and Vermont. Yeah, so I guess it's sort of, the echoes of Mormonism, of course, being the fact that Joe Smith and Brigham Young both born in Vermont. But those are the only 2 states. He gets 8 electoral votes. He is the worst defeated incumbent president in American history. You know who the second worst defeated incumbent president was? George Herbert Walker Bush. Okay, so another Yaley who ran afoul of other circumstances. So now, you know, Vermont being rather unique, as you can see. Now, the next player we have from Vermont in presidential politics is Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge. Now, here's a picture of Calvin's dad, John, who raised him after his mother died. It's Cal and his father. You know, talk about, you know, good old Vermont stock. And of course, Cal is vice president, was elected vice president, and became president upon the death of Warren Harding in the summer of 1923, when it is alleged that, you know, the Duchess, Harding's wife killed him by smothering him with a pillow, but that's not really true. But nevertheless, it's part of the legend. Of course, Harding was involved with a teenage girl, Nan Britton, and wrote a book saying that she had this child by Harding called The President's Daughter. And in her book, there's this incredible, fascinating encounter that she and Warren have in Plattsburgh, New York. I don't know anybody who's ever had a rendezvous in Plattsburgh, New York. But apparently, Warren Harding and Nan Britton, you know, I guess the last place anybody would find you would be Plattsburgh, New York. So apparently that's where that one took place. Okay, here we have these are wonderful pictures of Cal. Okay, yeah, this is sliding off there. Thanks, Robert. Okay, this is Cal running with Harding, who's a very, you know, handsome fellow. It's a wonderful chapter in a fascinating book called Blink, you know, where it talks about Harding. I did a presentation at Hildene last year about bad presidents. So, and I got the short straw. I got Warren Harding. And Warren Harding is no longer ranked as the worst president in America. That's now James Buchanan. And he's no longer the worst Harding in America. That title belongs to Tanya Harding. So here's Warren, handsome devil, and there's Cal. Because Cal wins, gets the vice presidency for breaking the Boston police strike. Now, Cal, very serious fellow. However, come across some pictures of Cal where he looks almost, and because Cal runs in 1924, does very, very well, as you can see. He does very, very well. Wins this massive landslide, losing only the South and, you know, and Oklahoma. Loses Wisconsin to Robert La Follette, but wins this massive landslide in 1924. Now, this election is somewhat dimmed for him because shortly after around the time of the convention, his son died. His son, Calvin Jr., died of blood poisoning, which, and a book by my good friend Bob Gilbert says, put Calvin Coolidge into a fit of almost chronic clinical depression. And so the long hours of sleeping, 10, 12 hours a day, he attributes to the depression that Cal sunk into after the death of his son. Now, we do have happy pictures of Cal, and here we go. This is Cal as the dashing undergraduate at Amherst, and this is Cal actually smiling and doffing his hat, yes. And he had to have a good disposition because he had lucked out. He had lucked out by marrying the beautiful Grace Goodhue, UVM. I'm not sure what's happening there. Grace Goodhue of Burlington, Vermont, and they married, as we know, down here a few blocks away down on Maple Street. And it's a very wonderful, glamorous picture of Grace. One of the stories about Cal and Grace is, well, Will Rogers was so impressed by Grace's charm and beauty that he thought he'd become a Democrat, become a Republican after meeting Grace. But Cal and Grace were out at the farm one time, and Grace is with the Secret Service and walking around the farm, and go past the hen house, and there's this, and this is early in the morning, and there's this rooster, having his way with the hens, and so Grace says to the Secret Service man, how often can he do that? And the Secret Service man says, oh, man, he can do that all day. She said, oh, well, why don't you tell that to the president? So later that day, Cal and the Secret Service man points over the rooster, and he's still having his way with her, and he says, sir, Mrs. Coolidge wanted me, did you know that rooster can do that all day long? So Cal says, same hen? No, sir, different hens. Tell that to Mrs. Coolidge. Okay, so Cal's the end of the line. However, what do we have? In 2004, what do we got? We have the governor. The governor. Here is a governor, very serious, very calm, the Howard Dean that he wants us to remember him by. How is he remembered by the nation, however? Please nominate this man. Yeah, this is how Howard Dean is remembered by the nation. A fairly dramatic photo, but this is a very typical one of Howard during that campaign. And as a person who fought with Howard on a regular basis, no surprise to me. I got the finger in the face in the State House one time. So the National Review said, you know what Vermont really is? It's hell. Vermont is hell. And just to let you know, how it got our state characterized. Okay, so that's the quick and dirty. And I have more maps. We'll talk about different counties, but I think this will be pretty much it. We all want to get home to see the debate, because this is going to be the ugly one. And questions? Yes, Peter.
I have two questions. First is, how does Vermont compare? I mean, I'm struck taking notes.
Yes.
But the number maybe up between, 1780 something and 1924. I mean, it's fairly regular that there's a Vermonter in there somewhere, right? How do you compare to New Hampshire or other states of comparable size?
New Hampshire had, of course, Pierce, who was the only elected president not to be renominated. He was elected in 1852, sad sack case, married the daughter of President Bowdoin. We went to school with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote his campaign biography. Pierce lapsed into serious alcoholism. John Hale, who was also from New Hampshire, ran as the Liberty candidate in 1852, third-party candidate. Of course, Webster had been involved, but Webster was actually, although a New Hampshire native, was actually running for Massachusetts when he was making his national rep. Yeah, New Hampshire does not quite, fare that well compared to Vermont, which is rather peculiar that it would do so. Maine had a few. Hannibal Hamlin, who was, of course, Lincoln's first vice president. James G. Blaine, who was from Pennsylvania but was nominated for Maine. Arthur Sewell, who was Bryan's vice president's running mate for Maine and owner of the Bath Iron Works in 1896. Tom Reed from Czar Reed of Maine, who was Speaker of the House, ran against McKinley and the convention in 1896, lost badly to McKinley, was so pissed off about losing to McKinley that when he became Speaker of the House, he found a way to quit the House of Representatives while McKinley was president, and he did so on the basis of the annexation of Hawaii. I don't know the distance between Hawaii and Portland, Maine, but I would imagine somewhere in the neighborhood like 5,000 to 6,000 miles. But it was a noble way for Reed to check out. And the next Mainer is Muskie, who is nominated for vice president in 1968, and of course gets knocked off in '72 by one of the Nixon dirty tricks. So Vermont, surprisingly, as I say, has done better than the other New England confreres in the northern corner. Massachusetts, of course, has done very well. And now Connecticut. Connecticut has its first native elected president, George Bush. And, of course, Joe Lieberman coming out of Connecticut. So Connecticut, after a long wait, finally got its piece of the pie. Rhode Island is still waiting. But Rhode Island, as you know, is an extension of Massachusetts. So it's it had a long wait. Other questions, please? Yes, Peter, keep going. Yeah.
What accounts? Okay, so there's a lot of Vermonters up to 1924. Right, then we got to leap up to Old.
Once a state becomes a one-party state, you basically, pretty much avoid it. But New England was doing. New England was had, well, from Vermont, from 1856 to when the Republican Party first appears. I mean, Vermont is voting Republican from 1856 to 1960. 27 elections in a row, Vermont votes Republican, the longest streak of any state in the history of this country. 27 consecutive elections for one party. And even with and most of those elections, Vermont was #1 in the country, the most Republican state in the Union. And that's what makes it sort of this recent history of Vermont, the fact that we've gone Democratic the last 4 elections, now that we're a blue state, and Obama has a 20-point lead in Vermont in the latest polls, really is an extraordinary part of the transformation. But New Hampshire, as you know, is still competitive. And my basic thesis on this is that in the 1960s, when people were moving, the so-called rural renaissance, were moving from the cities to basically escape, urban riots, when they came, through Massachusetts, and they come to where the Connecticut River joins, Massachusetts with Vermont and New Hampshire, and those who went left went to Vermont, and those who went right went to New Hampshire, very much in keeping with their ideological, propensities. So, and of course, people moved to Vermont. In the case of New Hampshire, they moved from Massachusetts. Important distinction. And they moved from Massachusetts, didn't want to pay taxes. They wanted Massachusetts jobs and New Hampshire taxes. So, that's, at least that's those of us from Boston believe that. But people moved to Vermont, and Vermont got transformed. And Vermont had, about 370,000 people in it in the 1960 census, and almost, it's over 600,000 now. And it grew tremendously with the arrival of yuppies, young urban professionals who moved to Vermont and stayed. That's the real story. They stayed, and they went from becoming yuppies to middle-aged rural professionals, we call MARPies, and they took over the state because they found, and mostly with liberal Democrats, and they found they could go to town meeting, and they could speak up, and they could play a role. They never, this was intoxicating for them. And they basically, took over the Democratic Party in the state. And because the Democratic Party in the state was a kind of a joke, was this sort of, French and Irish kind of rump entities, really the Catholic Party, they took over the party. And they elected, Phil Hoff from Massachusetts, and Tom Salmon from Ohio, and Madeline Cunha from Switzerland, and Howard Dean from New York. And they basically, took over the Democratic Party and reshaped the politics of the state. And now Vermont, as they say, is, one of the 3 or 4 bluest states in the Union. Yes, Michelle?
So if Howard Dean hadn't lost it, do you think it would have made it to the White House?
No, no. Just Howard Dean, the cranky little guy, He's a cranky, you know, I mean, Frank and I, who've dealt with Howard Dean on multiple occasions, totally self-consumed character. It was just a matter of time. Of course, Howard Dean told the Boston Globe back in 2003 that I had made a career out of trashing him. Howard, I have 7,000 pages in print. 3 pages are devoted to you. That's not a career. And he was just, I remember, you know, back I was being interviewed, the LA Times interviewed me, Liz Mayrins, and she said, what do you think about Howard Dean? I said, frankly, he's kind of a twerp. Now, she repeated that in the story. Now, when a reporter repeats what you say, that means that reporter agreed with you. And I've been around them long enough, after, you know, 4,000 plus interviews, and you know, figure out what they're up to. And I think that was sort of the, so people would interview me about Howard, and they'd say, did anybody else believe like you? I said, oh, you talked to Doug Racine, you talked to Liz Reedy, you know, talked to, you know, Dick McCormick, and I'm listing all these people to talk to. So the reporters would go interview Liz and, you know, Doug Racine and Dick McCormick and so on, and I'll say, oh, Howard Dean, I love Howard Dean. He's my friend. And he said, well, didn't you have disagreements? Oh, no, minor disagreements. I really, you know, and so the story would run, only one person crapping on Howard Dean, and it would be me. And everybody else was singing Howard's praises. So I got stopped on the street. By Judy Kelly, you know, and she goes, Gary, why are you saying these terrible things about our Howard? I said, Judy, when did this humorless little schmuck become our Howard? But the ultimate put down I received was from my granddaughter, Sophia, who was then 5 years old. And she says, Grandpa, do you know all you talk about? I said, what, Sophie? She says, Howard Dean, blah, blah, blah. Howard Dean, blah, blah, blah. So I was rebuked by a 5-year-old. Frank?
Yeah, I agree with you, Dean. I think that he screamed because he had already come in third in Ohio, and Ohio after he spent so much time out there.
And he knew it.
He was behind New Hampshire doing the time.
Yeah.
He was dead long. It wasn't screaming that it was
Yeah.
Howard's. And Tom Rice, a former colleague of ours, I talked to him a couple of weeks before that, before the scream, and he said, and Tom was in his a teeny. He says, Howard just came out here and started telling Iowans how to govern themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I do disagree with you on one thing, and that's the breakthrough. I mean, I understand that the newcomers generally were just exactly what you said, but they sure as hell didn't, I like Phil Haas in 1962, and Haas' big gains came in the Northeast Kingdom. Right. And the major breakthrough was...
Major breakthrough is really 50s. And in 58, the Democrats actually elected congressman. And frankly, they elected a governor, too, but the legend is that Bernie Leddy, a great Catholic family here in town, lost the election after midnight when the votes started to disappear in some of the Protestant towns. And that was the... when I came to Burlington, that was the thing I got told. I got called late one night about, check on them, how they stole the votes, and, you know, from the Protestants stole the votes from Bernie Leddy. And
the interesting one was the Cat, who got more votes in 1960 and lost because it was a presidential election turnout than Hoff got.
Kennedy was relatively competitive in Vermont in 1960, and then of course Hoff winning in '62. And it's but it was Phil's beckoning country campaign advertising that brought these newcomers in, and that's when the population and Vermont's growth from 1960 to 1970 and 1990 is almost all in migration from other parts of the country, as opposed to sort of natural growth. And Vermont, both in the 1970 and 1980 census, exceeded the national growth rate, largely by in-migration. Yeah. Not so much today, but certainly in those 2 census years. Travis?
Yeah, you started by noting how many small states are in play right now today with Palin, Biden, lots of Hawaii, yada, yada.
Yeah.
Why? Do you have an explanation for why? I mean, is it just a coincidence? What's going on with there's so many of those right now?
The media is an equalizer. I mean, the Senate's an equalizer. I mean, you can come from a small state like you know, Wyoming and be a floor leader. You can come from Kansas and be a floor leader like Dole was. or from Maine, like George Mitchell. So the media is an equalizer, and it can give you a national platform regardless of the size of the state. In the days of yore, when you basically cobbled together big states, and, and you put, for 1948, the Republicans nominate Tom Dewey from New York, and the governor of New York, and Earl Warren, the governor of California. Figure this is what you do. You assemble these big states and build electoral coalitions that way. But I'd say the media has become an equalizer, and so it doesn't really matter where you're from if you can get yourself a national platform, like Biden has been, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, or Cheney, as a floor leader as well, minority whip in the House of Representatives. You can compensate for the lack of state size. Yes, Peter?
I know that the Mainers take enormous pride in their representation at the national level, especially in the Senate.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious if there's anything similar going on with respect to Vermont. I know Leahy's very powerful. I don't know any of the history.
Yeah.
Apart from
Well, Vermont is Vermont and Hawaii, the only two states that have never voted out an elected U.S. senator. And we've been electing U.S. senators since 1914. We've never voted out an elected U.S. senator. Voted out an appointed one in the primary in the 1920s, but never voted out an elected U.S. senator. So Patrick Leahy is senator for life. And because of the seniority system, you get to be chairman. He's now chairman of the Judiciary Committee and is third in line to become chairman of the Appropriations Committee behind one guy who's 90, another guy's 86, so he figures he's got a good shot at it. And one of the other things about Vermont was that Bob Stafford was a committee chair, Leahy was a committee chair, and Jim Jeffords was a committee chair. So the accruing of seniority has redounded to Vermont's advantage, irrespective of which party happens to control the Senate. Will Bernie Sanders ever become a committee chair? God, heaven forbid. I said to the students, I said, when Bernie Sanders gets talking, he never stops. And I said, both parties will vote in filibuster reform, if Bernie gets on the floor. I meant this facetiously. A student wrote it down and recited it in Eileen Bergen's class. And as a fact, I said, no, it's a facetious remark. But nevertheless, it got repeated as gospel in Eileen's class. So I have to be careful what I say to my students. Not always, but sometimes. Yes. Other questions? Keep them coming. Yeah. So Vermont is going to, Vermont's election results are going to be over quickly. We were early decider. I think we were the second or third state announced an election night. Am I correct? In 2004 for Kerry. We'll be early on Obama. As you know, the first state always to decide is Indiana, which has the Indiana ballot. It's got a party column ballot. And so Indiana will come in. And if Indiana comes in for Obama, the election is over. The election is over. Indiana hasn't gone Democratic since Lyndon Johnson in 1964. So watch that first state. If it's Indiana, I guess it will be. And if it comes in for Obama, it'll be a quick night. If it comes in for McCain, we're in for a long night. So things to look for on election night. Which is what, 4 weeks from tonight? Amazing, amazing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.